The room shimmered with chandeliers, and everything smelled faintly of old perfume and polished silver. I remember standing there near the entrance of the gala hall, clutching the tiny gold invitation in my hand like it might vanish. The kind of event you only see in movies: velvet tablecloths, waiters with white gloves, and people who never had to worry about bills or borrowed dresses. But I wasn't thinking about the food or the orchestra playing quietly in the corner. I was thinking about them. My family. My mother's sharp voice telling me, "Don't embarrass us." My brother's smirk, always half a second away from a joke I didn't want to hear. And my father, well, he wouldn't say much. He'd just stare past me, like I was the flickering light in the hallway no one had fixed yet. They stood by the far wall, huddled together in their glitter and pride, laughing at something my brother had said. I hadn't even been told they'd be here tonight. Of course not. That would have required a call. A message, a moment of thought. But that's how it's always been, hasn't it? My name is Lillian, and I wasn't always invisible. I just slowly faded that way over the years. I was raised in a family where recognition came in the shape of medals, promotions, and headlines. My father was a decorated colonel. My brother went into international law. My mother made sure every holiday card came with a list of what we've accomplished this year. And me, I chose a different path. One quieter, less shiny. I served quietly in military logistics. Not glamorous, not front line, but it mattered. I believe that. Still do. But to them, it was like saying I worked in a basement somewhere, pushing paper and dodging meaning. Even when I received the Distinguished Service Award, not one of them called. So when I got the invitation to this military gala personally signed by General Raymond Cole, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would matter. I remember taking a deep breath before stepping further into the room, my heels clicking too loudly in my ears. I'd worn a dark blue dress, simple and clean, with my single silver brooch, the only thing of my grandmother's I still kept. The lights caught on the metal pinned quietly near my heart. I saw my mother glance my way, then lean into my father. Their laughter didn't pause. I stood by the side wall, pretending to look at the list of honorees on the printed banner. Then, suddenly, everything changed. The general entered. Not just any general. The general, Raymond Cole. Retired now, but still the most respected man in the room. He was the kind of man whose presence made people stand straighter. My father used to quote him at the dinner table like scripture. People surrounded him quickly. He nodded politely, shaking hands, then began moving toward the center. I didn't expect him to notice me, but then his eyes met mine. He paused and walked directly to where I stood. I didn't have time to prepare. He stopped, placed a hand gently on my shoulder, and said loud enough for every nearby guest to hear. She carried more than any man in that room. Just 7 words. That was all. But the sound that followed, or rather, the silence. That silence was louder than any applause. My family froze. My mother's smile vanished like steam from a mirror. My father's hands twitched slightly at his sides. And my brother, he opened his mouth, then closed it again. The general turned to them without missing a beat. "I know your daughter well," he said. "She's the reason half the men on my last deployment came home." He said it like a truth etched in stone, not a compliment. A fact. Then he walked on. And just like that, for the first time in my life, my family didn't know what to say. There was a moment after he left when I couldn't breathe. My heart was thudding so hard I thought the brooch on my chest might snap loose. I looked over, expecting maybe what? An apology? A nod? But they didn't move. I turned away first. Funny how all those years of trying to be noticed, to be good enough, to hear something kind from the people who were supposed to love me, none of that mattered as much anymore. Because someone had seen me. Really seen me. And it didn't come from blood. It came from truth. I stepped out onto the balcony, away from the crowd, and looked out over the city. The night was clear. A few stars poked through the haze. My hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. You know what it felt like? Like something heavy had finally been lifted. Like I didn't need to explain myself anymore. Like all the invisible weight I'd carried had been acknowledged not by everyone, just by someone who knew. There was a time, years ago, when I tried to show my parents a letter from a wounded soldier I'd helped coordinate transport for. He had written that I'd saved his leg by getting the right medevac crew in faster than protocol allowed. I handed it to my mother. She skimmed it, said, "That's nice, dear," and moved on to talk about my brother's latest trip to Geneva. It was always like that. It wasn't just the ignoring, it was the erasing. So that night at the gala, when the general said those 7 words, it felt like someone had rewritten the script. And this time, I wasn't invisible. I stayed out on the balcony for longer than I planned. The cool air helped me breathe again. I rested my hands on the stone railing, watching cars move below like tiny glowing insects. People in the room behind me were still murmuring, still pretending to talk about wine and politics. But I knew some were whispering about what they had just seen, and I knew they were too. My family. It wasn't anger I felt in that moment. Not even pride. Really. It was something quieter, like a river that had finally broken through after years of pushing against stone. A quiet power I hadn't realized I still had in me, but that didn't come overnight. You see, I wasn't always strong. There was a time I nearly gave up on myself altogether. I remember the Christmas I didn't go home. The first one. It had been a long year. Our supply chain got wrecked overseas, and I'd worked 19-hour days for 2 months straight. I'd helped reroute emergency aid to a bombed-out school zone, got commendations, even a mention in the division newsletter. But when I called to say I might not make it home on time, my mother said, "Well, if you're not going to be here, I suppose we'll just do it without you." She didn't ask if I was okay, or tired, or lonely. I spent that Christmas alone in my apartment, eating leftover chicken and watching black and white movies on mute because the sound made the silence worse. No one called. No one asked. I remember crying not because I was sad, but because I felt erased, like I didn't exist in their world anymore, like I had been written out of the family script. After that, I stopped trying as much. I still sent cards, still called on birthdays, but something inside me stopped knocking on their door. Instead, I poured myself into the work, and in that space, away from expectations and judgment, I found something else. I found people, the ones who stayed late without being asked, the ones who volunteered for the hardest shifts, the ones who knew how to build morale with a bad joke and a strong coffee. I remember one night, in Kandahar. There was a young tech sergeant fresh out of training, barely 20, panicking over a logistics error that could have delayed a life-saving shipment. He was sweating through his uniform, whispering that he'd never make it in this field. I sat with him until midnight, helped him fix the mess, told him about the first time I messed up a routing code and got chewed out so badly I nearly resigned. That boy wrote to me a year later, just a note. Nothing fancy, and said, "You made me feel like I mattered." That saved me. It was the first time I realized that maybe strength doesn't always look like loud voices and medals. Maybe it looks like quiet shoulders carrying what no one else wants to touch. Back at the gala, I finally gathered enough breath to turn around and re-enter the hall. I wasn't sure what I'd say to them. My parents, my brother. Part of me still ached like a child, hoping for warmth in a room where the fire's long gone out. But when I walked back in, they were still standing there, waiting. It was my mother who spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us you knew General Cole?" I smiled gently. Would it have mattered? Her lips parted, then closed again. My father cleared his throat. He said you helped bring his men home. I nodded. Yes, sir. I did. Silence again. Heavy, awkward silence. And then something surprising happened. My brother Michael looked at me. Not past me, not through me. At me. You really did all that? I met his eyes. Yes. And a lot more that never made it to your holiday cards. He chuckled softly. It wasn't mocking. For once. I guess I've been a bit of a jerk. You think I said, and for the first time in years, we both laughed short, sharp, almost startled. Something in the air shifted. Not everything, not suddenly, but enough. I won't pretend that moment fixed everything. My parents didn't suddenly wrap me in their arms and tell me they were sorry. No, that's not how people like them change. But they listened when I spoke. They asked questions that weren't laced with judgment. And for the first time, they saw me outside the shadow of what they'd wanted me to be. Later that night, after the crowd began to thin, the general found me again. You held yourself with grace, he said, even when they didn't. I nodded, unable to say much. My throat was tight again, but not from pain, from something that felt like healing. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said, You remind me of the best kind of soldier, one who doesn't need applause to keep moving forward. Then he was gone, and I just stood there, feeling whole. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes it only takes one voice, one real, grounded voice to shake loose years of doubt, to tell you, you mattered. You still do. And now, I wonder, have you ever waited your whole life for someone to finally acknowledge what you've carried quietly all this time? Maybe someone will. Maybe someone already has and you didn't notice, because you were too busy trying to get it from the wrong people. If that's ever happened to you, I'd love to hear your story. Just knowing you're out there might mean more than you think. After the gala, things didn't magically transform, but something subtle changed in the way my family looked at me. The silence around my name started to crack. My mother called the next morning, just a short conversation, asking how I was feeling, if I got home okay. She didn't say I'm proud of you. She didn't need to. Her voice was softer than usual, less clipped, like she was speaking to a person instead of a role she never understood. And Michael, he sent a message a week later. A real message, not a group thread. It just said, that night made me think. I'm sorry I never asked you more about what you do. I should have. I didn't reply right away, because honestly, I needed time to figure out how I felt. About everything. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are the ones we get used to living with. The ones that feel like background noise until someone turns off the static. And we finally hear the silence for what it is. That's what it had been like growing up. You see, I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't lazy. I didn't get into trouble. I just wasn't what they imagined. I liked quiet. I liked order. I liked making things work from behind the scenes. I didn't need to be the face of anything. I wanted to be the hands. When I told my family I was enlisting not in combat, but in logistics, my father had said, You're wasting your potential. My mother had said, At least be a nurse. That's respectable. Michael had laughed and asked, So, you'll be organizing boxes? I nodded. I was 19. I still remember how small I felt in that room, like a chair no one wanted to sit on, like a photo left off the wall. But I knew, deep inside me, I knew that work mattered, even if it wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of knowing that didn't need clapping. Still, there were moments, dark ones, where I questioned myself. There was one mission in particular, northern Syria. Supplies had been rerouted incorrectly due to a systems glitch. My team was responsible for fixing it. We had 48 hours to get emergency food and medical equipment to an isolated unit with no communication. No one could reach them. Everyone said it was too late, but I didn't accept that. I remember sitting in that freezing tent, cross-referencing maps, codes, and data manually for 12 hours straight. I rerouted through an abandoned airstrip and negotiated a clearance with a local contractor who owed us a favor. The supplies got there. 2 lives were saved. No ceremony, no speech. Just a silent thank you from a returning officer who passed me in the corridor 6 weeks later. I held on to moments like that. Quiet victories, private truths. And I think that's what made the general's words at the gala so powerful. Because they came from someone who understood. Not just what I did, but what it cost. When I was younger, I used to think love meant being praised, being noticed. But over time, I learned that sometimes love shows up in smaller, heavier ways. In staying, in remembering, in seeing someone's invisible labor and saying, I see you. I see what you carried. And isn't that what we all want to be seen? A few weeks after the gala, Michael invited me to lunch. Just the 2 of us. We hadn't done that in over 10 years. He picked a little cafe near his office. Too expensive for the food it offered, but cozy, safe, familiar in a strange way. We sat across from each other, awkward at first. Then he said something I didn't expect. I told Dad what the general said again. I don't think he knew how much you've done. I tilted my head. He never asked. Michael nodded. Yeah, that's on us. Then he looked down, fiddled with the spoon in his coffee. I think we thought you were running away from the family, he said. But maybe you were just running towards something else. That struck me, because I had never seen it like that. But he was right. I wasn't escaping them. I was choosing something different. Something mine. I looked at him and said, I never wanted to be better than any of you. I just wanted to be me, and for that to be enough. He looked back at me, and this time, there was no smirk, just quiet eyes, a bit of shame, a bit of relief. It is, he said. It is now. That lunch didn't fix everything. It didn't wipe away years of feeling like I had to prove my worth. But it helped. It opened a new page. Not clean, not empty, but writable. A few days ago, I found a small card in the mail, no return address. Inside, it read, Some of the bravest people wear no rank. Thank you for being one of them. I have no idea who sent it, but I kept it, right next to the letter from that wounded soldier, and the gala invitation with General Cole's signature. They're tucked in a wooden box on my bookshelf. Not because I need to be reminded, but because they belong to me. You know, it's easy to think your quiet strength doesn't matter, that if no one notices, it must not be real. But I promise you there's someone out there who sees what you've done, and even if they don't, you still did it. That's yours. Always. People ask me sometimes what kept you going when no one clapped, when no one noticed, and I usually smile and say, well, someone had to keep the wheels turning. But the truth runs deeper than that. It was never about recognition. It was about responsibility. I didn't carry the logistics clipboard because it was the only thing I was offered. I carried it because someone had to make sure the right supplies reached the right hands at the right time, or people would die. That weight? It's real. Not flashy, not Instagram-worthy, but very real. You see, the world needs people who are willing to do the unnoticed work, the backbone tasks, the quiet hours behind the curtain while others are applauded on stage. But living like that for long enough without acknowledgement, without even a nod from the people closest to you, it wears on you. It makes you question your worth in a world that claps only for noise. I remember one particular winter, stationed at a joint base in Germany. Snow had blanketed the compound, freezing everything into stillness. Flights delayed, rations short, troops waiting for gear that was stuck 2 countries away. I stayed up for 3 nights coordinating backups, reroutes, and translations. By the end of it, I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten much, and had blisters from walking back and forth between departments trying to fix what had broken. And the day after, everything settled. No ceremony. No good job. Just another request from command and a new batch of problems. That night, I sat by the barracks window, alone with a cold coffee, and thought, does anyone know? Does anyone care? That was the closest I ever came to calling it quits. But then I remembered the look on one young soldier's face that morning when his winter gear finally arrived, just before he was due to go on night patrol. He didn't even say thank you. Just pulled the coat on and exhaled like someone who didn't think he'd be warm again. And I realized that was enough. That quiet exhale. That relief. That was the sound of a job well done. But I still wish, sometimes, that my father had seen that version of me, not the daughter who chose a boring desk job, not the one who wasn't invited to speak at family gatherings, but the woman who kept others alive, who never needed a spotlight but still deserved to be seen. He was a man of few words, never cruel, just distant, reserved, always chasing discipline, order, reputation. The military ran through his veins like salt in seawater. I spent most of my life trying to impress him. Once, when I was 12, I won a regional spelling bee. My teacher had called home to say I'd been one of the youngest winners they'd ever seen. At dinner that night, I waited for him to say something. He just nodded and said, "You should aim higher next time." That one sentence sat in my stomach for years like a stone. So maybe it's no surprise that when I joined logistics, his reaction wasn't rage, it was disappointment, which, honestly, hurt more. After the gala, after the general's words echoed through the marble walls like a hymn, my father didn't say much. Not at the event, not the next day, but a month later. I got a letter, handwritten, his handwriting sharp, small, deliberate, the kind he used for mission notes and tax documents. It said, "Lillian, I served with General Cole when I was younger. He doesn't hand out praise lightly. If he said what he said, then it means you've done more than I realized. I regret not asking. You've made me think about the kind of father I was, and what I missed. You didn't fail this family. We failed to understand who you truly were." Dad, I read that letter 5 times in one sitting. Then I cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from years of holding something inside and finally letting it go. You see, I never needed to be better than my family. I just wanted to be part of it. And I think that's what hurt the most, being surrounded by people who claimed me in name, but never in spirit. But I've learned something important sometimes. The validation we crave doesn't come when we want it. And sometimes, it doesn't come at all. But that doesn't mean the work you've done, the heart you've poured out, the nights you stayed up carrying others, it doesn't mean those things are any less valuable. It just means you have to learn how to carry yourself when no one else is clapping. And eventually, if you keep going, someone will see you. Maybe a general, maybe a stranger, maybe someone who needed what you gave and didn't know how to say it. A few weeks ago, I was invited back to that same gala, but this time, not as a guest, as a speaker. When I walked up to the podium, I wore the same dark blue dress, the same silver brooch, and that same medal near my heart. I looked out at a room full of young recruits, seasoned officers, civilians, and old commanders. And I told them, not all heroes make noise. Some carry clipboards and spreadsheets. Some reroute fuel lines at 2 a.m. Some make coffee and remind others to breathe. But they matter. And if you've ever felt like you're working in the shadows, remember, light doesn't always come from applause. Sometimes it comes from within. The applause that night, it wasn't for the general, it wasn't for my family, it was for me. But by then, I didn't need it. It was just a warm breeze on a hill I'd already climbed. After the gala, and after the letter from my father, I started seeing my life a little differently, not dramatically, but quietly. Like someone had opened a window in a long-closed room, and fresh air had crept in, not with a roar, but with a whisper. I began going through my old notebooks, my mission journals, the folded letters from soldiers I'd helped, things I used to tuck away, almost ashamed of. Not because they weren't valuable, but because no one had ever asked to see them. And now, I wanted myself to see them. Not for proof, but for remembrance. There was one entry from a dusty evening in 2013 in southern Iraq. The kind of day where the heat soaks into your bones and never leaves. I'd been trying for 36 hours to locate a missing convoy. Communications were down. Morale was worse, and I'd nearly given up hope when I got a crackling radio update found him. They're low, but alive. We're going in. I collapsed back into my cot that night with the overwhelming, quiet kind of joy, the kind that comes from knowing you didn't give up when it counted. No one ever mentioned it again. But I wrote it down. And reading that entry years later, I realized that woman, she was brave, she was strong, and she never needed anyone else to say it. You know, when you grow up being told that humility means silence, you start believing your story isn't worth telling unless someone else gives you permission. But you don't need permission to be proud of the quiet victories, and you don't need applause to honor the strength it took to get through the days when no one stood beside you. I had to learn that over time, the hard way. Not long ago, I got a message from an old cadet I had mentored years back. Her name was Amy. Back then, she was scared of her own shadow. She'd shake during roll call, constantly second-guess herself, apologizing for everything. I worked with her for months, not because it was my job, but because I saw myself in her, a young woman who didn't think she had the right to stand up tall. In her message, she said, "You told me once that real leadership isn't about shouting, it's about remembering everyone's name and making sure they feel seen." I never forgot that. I use it every day now. Just wanted you to know. I sat with that message for a long time, because she didn't owe me anything. She didn't have to write, but she did. And that reminded me kindness echoes, sometimes years later, sometimes in voices you never expected. As for my family, well, we've settled into something gentler. My mother still talks too much about my brother's law firm, but now, she also mentions my work. She asks where I'm stationed, if the conditions are livable, if I'm getting enough rest. It's a start. And my father, we don't talk often, but when we do, he asks real questions now. No more comparing, no more silence, just a man who's learning, late in life, how to see his daughter for who she is, not who he imagined. Sometimes I wonder if I'd still be standing here today if the general hadn't said those 7 words at the gala. She carried more than any man in that room, not because I needed his approval, but because that moment cracked something open, gave others a reason to pause, gave me the courage to stop hiding behind usefulness and finally claim my space. You don't need someone to validate your life for it to matter, but every once in a while, when someone powerful uses their voice to lift up the quiet ones, it changes everything. And maybe that's what true leadership is, not being loud, but knowing when to speak, and for whom. I still wear that same silver brooch to events, not because it's fancy, but because it reminds me of my grandmother, who was the first woman I ever saw stand in silence and still command a room. She used to say, "Don't waste your breath proving who you are. Just be it. Let time do the talking. She'd lived through war, poverty, and raising 3 children alone, and she did it all without ever asking for recognition. I used to think that made her invisible. Now I know it made her indestructible. So if you've carried your life quietly, if you've shown up day after day with no applause, no spotlight, no grand thank you, know this: you are seen, you are valid, and you have the right to stand in any room, shoulders back, chin lifted, not because someone told you to, but because you belong there. I've told my story not because it's unique, but because I know there are thousands like me, people who've built lives from invisible bricks, who've supported others while being forgotten, who've kept things moving, even while feeling stuck. And maybe this is your reminder: you are not forgotten. You are the spine of more stories than you know. I think there comes a moment in every life when you stop waiting for someone to open a door for you and you realize, quietly and completely, that you can build your own. The gala didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years I spent hoping to be chosen, hoping to be noticed, hoping to matter in a room full of people who only saw what sparkled. But it did something more important. It reminded me that even in a world full of noise, quiet strength is still strength. And sometimes, it's the most enduring kind. 2 months after the gala, I was invited to a leadership retreat at the base near Colorado Springs. Not to observe, not to serve coffee or take minutes, but to speak. Me, the woman in logistics, the woman who organized boxes, the woman who carried more than any man in that room, because she had to. I stood in front of a room filled with young recruits, seasoned commanders, and even a few skeptical old-timers who still believed a title mattered more than truth. And I told them the story I've just told you. Not all the details, some things are mine to keep. But I told them what it meant to be overlooked, to work in silence, to be forgotten by your own family, and to still show up. Every day, every mission, every year, because that's what real service looks like. And when I was done, when the room stood up, not for a general, not for a medal, but for me, I felt something click into place. Not validation, not pride, just peace. Like I had finally stopped knocking on the wrong doors, like I had finally come home. There's a photograph I keep now, framed in my office. It's not from any official event, not a ceremony or parade. It's from a dusty tent in the middle of nowhere. Years ago, I'm sitting on a metal folding chair, holding a busted laptop in my lap, coffee cup in hand, hair tied back, eyes fixed on the screen in front of me, unshowered, exhausted, focused. That's me. That's the woman who made things happen. That's the woman I fought to become. And now, when I go back to visit my parents, things are quieter. Not awkward, just calm. My mother sets an extra place for me now, even if I arrive late. She asks about my work. And this time, she listens. My father doesn't say much, but sometimes I catch him watching me when I speak. And once, when I was leaving, he said, "You turned out strong." That was all. And that was enough. As for Michael, he and I have coffee together every month now. We talk about real things. He asks my opinion. He introduces me as his sister with pride now. He even asked me once to speak to his daughter's class about women in the military. I said yes. Not because I needed to be a hero, but because every little girl needs to know that even if the world forgets her, she can still remember herself. So if you're reading this or listening to my voice, and you've ever felt like the background noise in your own family's story, if you've ever worked yourself to the bone, hoping someone would finally say, "You did well," and the silence that followed made you question your place, let me be the one to tell you, you did well. You mattered. You matter. And if no one has said it yet, I see you. You're not alone. Not even close. You belong in every room you walk into, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've become in the process. You earned your place the hard way, and no one can take that from you. If this story touched you, if you've ever waited for a moment like mine, or if you've lived it and come out the other side stronger, tell me, tell us, because sometimes sharing your quiet story gives someone else the courage to finally speak theirs. And maybe, just maybe your 7 words will change someone's life.